Welcome to Praise, Prayer and Preaching with the Rev Dr Keith Garner.
Welcome to the Wesley Theatre here in Sydney. The desire has been in my heart for some time to write a series for here in the Wesley Theatre and on television, which captures some of the personal challenges that we have to face in life. And I hope this series of addresses strike a note that's twofold: pastoral in content, by way of focus and offering gentle biblical guidance, and practical in such a way that the guidance that we discovered there can be applied in real specific circumstances to our lives. The title of the series is, Does Anyone Actually Care? That, I think, puts the addresses into a framework which is that culture, that age that we live in today, where many people feel somehow isolated, fragmented, and left scrambling for help. There are times when we feel nobody cares, and we need to be reminded of the truth of Scripture, that one does care for us. And how do we understand that caring in our lives? We need not remain alone. I begin by talking about the effectiveness of tears and how they can and often do bring healing and a new beginning into people's lives. I recall the little girl. She had a terminal illness. She was only little, but she was old enough to understand what was happening. And she asked the nurse for a crying doll. The puzzled nurse said, "Why do you want a doll that cries?" Her reply had an honesty and a profundity that goes with little children sometimes. She said, "Because Mummy and I both need to cry, and Mummy won't cry in front of me, and I won't cry in front of her, but if the doll cries, all three of us can cry together." The story provides, I think, a helpful starting point in understanding that tears can be very creative and helpful in our lives. Tears, or some untapped emotion within our lives, can release something of God's love within us. Release something of that cap on the pain that lies deep within. Now, we're all aware that there are different kinds of tears. There are the performance tears. We often use the term crocodile tears. There are certainly the tears of bitterness. The genuine tears I speak of are those that enable us to understand where we are, perhaps even to let go and make way for a new beginning. Another introductory point would be to emphasize that tears are not just for women either. In Lament for a Son, Nicholas Wolterstorff related how he found himself crying after the death of his son in a climbing accident. He reflected, "Our culture says men must be strong, and that the strength of a man in sorrow is to be seen in a tearless face. Tears are for women. Tears are signs of weakness, and women are permitted to be weak. We must, all of us, mask our suffering, must we? I mean, may we not sometimes allow people to see and enter it? May men not do this also?" It was the first time that Nicholas had ever really come face to face with that dilemma of trying to compartmentalize the different emotions that people have and put them into gender brackets. Psalm 126 speaks from from two perspectives. Firstly, from the perspective of one who is living in very challenging times, a very unhappy time in a people's history in one sense, a time when the high promise is on the agenda. But it's experienced by a people that were rebuilding physically and communally after a time of devastation inflicted by the Babylonians. What might have been a time filled with hope is but a distant memory. But it gives way to something better, because our psalm here and so many of the psalms become a part of a community hoping and dreaming and grasping something better. The text is verse 5. "Those who sow with tears will reap with songs of joy." There's a particular historical context that you add to that first perspective. At some festival, some special occasion, this would be something that people would sing because they would know that God somehow had been with them in the challenges that they faced. The text, however, can describe our own lives sometimes. We discover the power of tears, which can make way in a most amazing way for healing and for positivity in our lives, out of something that is often viewed and seen from the perspective of weakness. The psalm has been classed by some as a national lament. In the Old Testament, there are many laments. It's a concept that's worth grasping, at least for a moment. To mourn or to cry aloud, to weep or to wail, to chant a mournful song. It doesn't really fit into so much of our Christian understanding of the way we might pray or think about things. But to lament is to engage the whole body, the mind, the emotion, everything in the circumstance and situation that we find ourselves. And a lament has some richness about it, for it's heartbreaking, but it's a heartbreaking that gives way to hope. The experience is one of being caught in a typhoon of the sorrows, but even within the storm, seeing the possibility of a new beginning. Some have identified this psalm as one of the most beautiful in the whole of the Psalter. But the beauty doesn't really lie so much in the language. You couldn't really argue that truth. But certainly in the way in which the poetic reach of the psalm actually resonates with human experience. J.E. McFadden said the psalm passes swiftly through the different changes of life. You look at it and open it up, you'll see so many of the different experiences. Laughter and tears, sorrow and joy, dejection, exaltation, exile and redemption, spring and autumn, dream and reality. So many things in but a few verses. The sorrow is all swallowed up in a splendid vision of a conclusion which has tears and joy so close together. And the particular picture has some real sense of contextualization because south of Jerusalem, south, there is a place in the Negev where in fact you'd understand what this psalm was all about. In the summer, the land appeared barren, the heat was pitiless, and the earth just opened up because of the heat. And in the barren place, there comes something better. Streams where beasts can take refreshment. Autumn brought rain, which refresh the earth and fill the wadis in that context. And the psalmist is really touching the deep places of human experience. He treats tears as normal. Now, I find that helpful. If tears are abnormal, we will struggle with them. But if tears are seen as normally part of life, then we can handle them far more easily. And we can allow ourselves, give ourselves permission, as we say, to shed a tear. Whether that's a tear of regret, of hurt, of sympathy, of identity with another. We readily identify sorrow with personal loss. But it's got a much wider scope than bereavement. There's the loss of identity, the loss of position, the loss of abilities. All those things are captured together. But our tears must eventually lead to some sense of healing. For our tears to simply be introspective and allow our tears to repeat themselves and woe is me, and not see that tears can open the doorway onto something better on the refreshing springs of autumn. A number of things about tears. Tears are not a sign of weakness but of strength. That's a proposition worth making. We're prone to see tears as either negative or weak, and leave little room or scope for understanding the positive qualities and even their strength. You see, tears can testify to love. Love calls for courage. It always finds itself being prepared to be risked. Every loss that brings tears is an opportunity to find new depth and new feeling. Growth is nearly always frightening. Of course, we see it in a child. This week, our eldest grandchild went to school for the first time. So we were desperate to see on FaceTime the pictures stuck up there so that we could have a quick look on Facebook at the pictures that might tell us. And there he was, stood in the corridor with his new pumps on, his new uniform. So proud, first day at school. But we'd spoken on Skype just a few days earlier, and we knew how challenging it was, how frightening. But it isn't just for children. All our lives, new experiences can be very, very frightening. They open up the opportunity of a new beginning. Tears that spring out of fear can sometimes bring hope. We return to the fields for the harvest and for the psalmist who knew what it was to sow in barren times. The picture is conjured up there of one who knows what it is to go and scatter the seed. You can't help but think of Jesus telling his parable of the sower, can you, when you read Psalm 126? And do you know, as the seed was thrown in the ground, the sower would wail. If you were in the field, you would hear him wail, or her, as the seed was thrown in the ground, because there was the belief that in the wail that there was something that had the promise of fertility, the promise of life. And so we begin to understand that this psalm was a very real picture of what actually happened for people in daily life. You see, think about the life of Israel, how closely the life of Israel is linked to tears. At that very, very central moment in the calendar of Israel, we have the Passover. And there we have salty water that reminds us of the tears of the children of Israel who knew what it was to find themselves in such pain and suffering. The vision is of a great time of harvesting, but how often were there tears? At times, our tears can be an embarrassment to other people. We'll return to that in a moment or two. However, they can show strength of feeling. Whenever anyone's been through a time or experience of loss, one of the things we want to be able to do very often is cry appropriately. Gosh, if only we could do it in that way. Everything would just work out neatly, and we would cry on our own, and we would cry here, but we can't always do that. So we're grateful at human beings that give us permission to cry, that give us permission to express those tears that are really part of our life. We become a vulnerable people. And the strength and character of a person's life is their willingness to be vulnerable, to make decisions that not everybody likes, but put them in a vulnerable place, to experience in life things that happen and not feel that we've got to somehow hide them, but say, here I am. This is my experience. And you know, we can spend the whole of our time trying to cover up our tracks and cover up our vulnerability. But tears say quite clearly, here it is, it hurts, and it's real. How do we relate this to the gospel of Jesus? It's not only an interesting question to ask, but it's a fundamental gospel question for all of us. We need go no further than the parable of the sower to learn that in life, much seed will be wasted. It's the indiscriminate casting of the seed. How many preachers, as soon as they get to those early chapters and they come to the sower of the seed, they realize that it's found throughout the Gospels. It's such an important parable of Jesus, and we spend our time talking. First of all, we talk about the seed. And then when we've preached a good few years, we start talking about the soil, because we know it's really about the soil. When in point of fact, it's about the indiscriminate nature of God. That he goes and he's prepared to waste seed for the sake of the harvest. And that going and in that place, being willing to do that, it seems to me, tells us such an insight on God. We read in Matthew 5, blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Little John, we talked of a little girl, let's take a little boy now. Little John had his eyes full of tears and said to his mum, who was peeling onions, those onions are strong, Mum. I can smell them with my eyes. And you perhaps sense as many things with your eyes as ever you do in any other way. Strong people smell with their eyes as well as their hearts. Secondly, tears can be a way of alerting us to problems that have to be dealt with. Sometimes we cry because we're angry, afraid, guilty, helpless, worn out, generally depressed. There's a plethora of reasons why we might cry. It's normal to cry when we've lost. But excessive crying, excessive tears, after much time, alerts us to other problems. At whom am I angry? And why? Do I need to forgive? Are my guilt feelings normal ones of regret or more serious? Not eating properly, getting sufficient rest or exercise, and not being with other people may accentuate the normal feelings of depression. To care for ourselves, we need to be willing to identify with the deeply hidden tears of our hearts. Jesus can meet us there when a heart is honest and open before God. In The Broken Heart, the medical consequences of loneliness, James Lynch says that people can actually die of a broken heart. Tears can be helpful in allowing those things not to simply build up within us and not help. The general point here is that tears point us in a certain direction and can be an indicator of something more. We need to choose those people with whom we trust, with whom we feel that to cry with them will be a helpful thing. It could be that we're left with undealt with problems, that if we don't deal with them will only cause ultimately bitterness, indeed a cruel spirit. There's certainly one or two people in this crowd tonight who have their homes originally in southern Africa. At the very tip of South Africa is a cape, around which storms are always raging. One of the things that I always enjoy doing when I go to Cape Town to family, because our children are married to people from southern Africa, when I go there to that part of the world, is to see how the water on one side can be calm and on the other side can be raging unbelievably so. But for thousands of years, no one really knew what lay beyond the cape. No ship had ever returned to tell the tale. It was known as the Cape of Storms. And in the 16th century, that Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama successfully navigated his way around the Cape of Storms. Beyond that lay the shores of India and all the possibilities of a new world from somebody from Northern Europe. So they changed its name. It became the Cape of Good Hope. Very important change, isn't it? Storms to good hope. Storms and all that storms represent, fears and those things that for which we have uncertainty and a desire to get beyond because they hold us captive. To that hope, good hope that comes. Tears often need self-control in appropriate settings. We can cause unnecessary distress to others. A mother was once wrestling with this dilemma. She knew that she didn't want to find herself crying too often in front of her children because that might give them the impression that she didn't care for her husband who had just died. She knew that she had to do some crying. But how do I get it right? If I cry too much, that's going to feel to them like I really have no control over anything in my life. If I don't cry, it will look as though I don't love. So she chose the words very carefully. She said, I told them that they would sometimes see me crying, but they shouldn't worry because I needed to cry, and after a while, I would feel better again. Now, I know it's simplistic, but I think it's helpful. Scott Sullender wrote Grief and Growth and described our tears as an inner storehouse. Control may mean being willing to look to cry, purposeful grieving, smelling familiar smells, going to familiar places, allowing ourselves the permission to feel the hurt that we know is there, but saying it's okay to cry, it's okay to be real about the hurt that I feel at this moment in time. But Sullender was right. When the storehouse gets full, it needs to overflow. If we are to be whole people, we acknowledge that there's a place where tears can be real. And finding the right context for tears is equally important. For some, it's in the privacy of a room. For others, it's with the company of friends. For many, it is those deeply profound spiritual moments. For me, the table of God has always been a place where I've felt that tears could be shed. If I had a list of places where tears can be expressed in a way that is controlled, I would say that tears can be shed as a sign of love for people for whom we care. Sometimes when you make that pastoral visit, when somebody has lost somebody and you're sitting down with them, and as a pastor you take their hand and you talk together. It's amazing how many people have said, I'm very sorry, I'm crying. And gosh, I want to say, don't be sorry at all. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, the very tears that you shed is an indication of how much you actually love the person. And then trying to distinguish, what are the tears all about? Tears could be shed, revealing our own hurt in the context of love, but they must never be used as a weapon. Tears can be the beginning and the end of healing. But then finally, tears can wash clean the lens through which you look at life. Tears can clean our vision on the world. It's one of the positive Christian truths we find, I think, in the gospel of Jesus Christ. That when we look at the world through tears, it is possible to value that which we take for granted. Because of what God has done for us in Christ, He has helped us to see the world in a new and amazingly new way. Another psalm, Psalm 30, reads in this way: Weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. Isn't that wonderful? I think this helps us to express a truth which will support and comfort us. Sometimes to know that I may well be in tears at this moment, but this is not the end of the story. There's always hope because of Christ. It's amazing, really, when you read the Passion narrative, how much of the Passion narrative has tears within it. There are different tears. There are the tears of bitterness. In the early part of the 20th century, late 19th century, there were a whole host of books published at that great time of publishing, all lives of Jesus. It was amazing how many of them ended with the cross. There were admissions by many people writing that they wrote particularly that the story would end at the cross. If that were the case, then the writers ignored the expansion and continuation of the Christian faith. But remember this, on Easter Day, there were tears. In the garden, the one could not recognize him through her tears. And it was only when he spoke those words to her, in fact, one word, the most precious word of all, Mary, that suddenly the lenses were clean. She could see the world in a wonderfully new way. Well, oh, how those tears were important. They were tears of affection for the one that she loved and the one that she left. Sorrow and hurt can produce very negative reactions within us. I think of bitterness, withdrawal, rebellion, a whole pile of different things that can come out of those experiences of sorrow and hurt. But when we allow ourselves to know what it is to weep, then we can understand the psalmist saying that we may well sow in tears, but we can come with joy when those tears are shed to a new place of healing. No, I cannot possibly know into what I'm speaking, but I can know out of what I'm speaking. And for me, tears have been important at times in my life. And I would like to think that you would understand that. And that we would together on the beginning of this series recognize how tears are important in allowing us to grow and develop our lives and to move to a place of healing. Tears can help us to accept life, to learn to live with it, to handle it somehow constructively, to carry on with responsibilities and receive the presence of, wait for it, the tearful Christ. For what did he do? What did he do when he heard the death of his friends? What did he do when he came to that place where those three people, Lazarus and Mary and Martha, who had been so much a part of his life, when the news had been brought to him of the death of his friend? We come to that very tiny verse in Scripture that tells us Jesus wept. Oh, how I like those words. That Jesus wept. And if Jesus wept, then you can weep. Then I can weep. And we can find in the tearful Christ a way of real healing and of real possibility.